The sound of obsidian snapping wasn't supposed to echo through the transit tube, nor was the figure responsible supposed to be standing there in the aftermath. She stood only 1.6 meters tall, wearing a faded canvas jacket embroidered with Terra, handled with care across the shoulders. A soft tissue biped entirely ignoring the apex predators looming over her. The corridor lost all oxygen. It wasn't magic, just the gravity of absolute predatory focus. Vrakar attempted to rise, his pride blinding his survival instincts. Alina didn't shout, she didn't posture. She simply stepped inside his guard, clamped her bare hands around his thoracic plating and torqued. I thought we were the advanced ones. Let me show you exactly how wrong I was. 3 hours earlier, the dawn cycle illumination bathed drift station Kythera in a sterile, artificial golden hue. I stood pressed against the cold aluminum bulkhead of Sector 4. My chitinous camouflage plating involuntarily rippled ash gray, perfectly matching the dented wall paneling behind me. Hiding was both a biological reflex and my greatest moral failing as a Sylveth. Down the cavernous hall, Lyra crouched low to the grating. The hollow scratching of Calumin talons retreating on aluminum betrayed her rising panic. She held a cracked brass navigation compass tight to her sternum, a fragile shield forged from useless hope. The Ocularis spire operated on a simple, unspoken contract. We built a utopia out of glass, forgetting what happens when someone brings a hammer. On the surface, 60 standard years, or rather 62, if you count the initial orbital treaties of multi-species integration, looked flawless. Holographic banners depicted different species holding hands in perfect harmony. Polished chromasteel arches curved overhead, reflecting the massive silhouettes of the strong and distorting the diminutive shapes of the weak. Below that shining veneer, a brutal, ancient food chain governed the halls. The architecture itself reinforced this bleak reality. The umbral transit tube remained a known blind spot in this gleaming facade. The lighting always flickered here, casting long, predatory shadows against the walls. The spire's faculty scheduled their patrol routes specifically to avoid this corridor during the dawn cycle. Prioritizing optical harmony over actual safety meant deliberately looking away when the biological hierarchy asserted itself. I watched Warden Thade, a highly decorated security officer, pause at the junction. He checked his glowing chronometer, adjusted his crisp uniform collar, pivoted precisely on his heel, and marched in the exact opposite direction. The heavy thud of his boots faded into the distance. 3 lesser scholars scurried past my camouflage form immediately after, their eyes glued firmly to the deck plates. They understood the rules of the station perfectly. Survival meant absolute invisibility. Vrakar of House Zur did not need to be invisible. Standing 2.8 meters tall, the Goreth air completely blocked the primary junction of the transit tube. Heat radiated from his thermal pit sensors in visible, distorting waves that blurred the air around him. Hyperdense muscle fiber shifted beneath his thick, obsidian-plated carapace with every deep breath. He didn't need any formal combat technique or martial training. Sheer, overwhelming mass granted him absolute authority over the space. Beside him, a Brashian lackey grunted, shifting its heavy, tree-trunk limbs in eager anticipation of collecting a morning toll. Lyra had nowhere else to go. The young Calumin girl possessed delicate bioluminescent glider sails and highly porous hollow bones. She was designed for artistic, zero-gravity aerial dances in the upper atmospheric roosts of her homeworld. Down here on the heavy-gravity deck of the station, she was nothing more than easy prey. She pressed her back tightly against the corridor edge. The sharp metallic clack of her brass compass striking her sternum echoed loudly in the oppressive silence. She tried frantically to calculate a safe trajectory of escape. There was no mathematical solution available. Then the primary airlock cycled open with a heavy, atmospheric hiss. Alina Rostova walked into the corridor with the loose-limbed swagger of a creature that didn't understand she was soft-tissue prey. She carried no visible weapons. Her forward-facing binocular eyes scanned the environment, absorbing thermal signatures, structural weaknesses, and social dynamics in a single, sweeping glance. Terran exchange scholars were an entirely new addition to the station, mostly viewed as fragile, water-filled curiosities by the older races. They bled easily from minor cuts. They required specific atmospheric pressures just to keep their lungs from collapsing. They were, by all galactic metrics, painfully vulnerable. Vrakar clicked his heavy mandibles together. A low, guttural sound of anticipated amusement rumbled deep within his broad chest cavity. He fully expected her to turn back upon seeing him, or perhaps cower silently against the wall like the rest of the student body. Alina didn't even look at him. She stopped casually beside a localized maintenance drone whirring near a busted ventilation conduit. Kneeling gracefully, she pinched a microscopic crumb from her morning ration bar and placed it gently on the drone's sensory chassis. "Good work, little guy," she whispered. The sheer absurdity of the gesture paralyzed the entire corridor. Vrakar's thermal pits flared a blinding toxic orange in instant fury. Disrespect offended him far more than any physical challenge ever could. To be ignored by a biologically inferior species was a permanent insult to his ancestral lineage. He lunged forward, completely ignoring the human now, and snatched Lyra violently by her left glider sail. The Kaluman shrieked in agony. A horrific sound of tearing membrane threatened to follow the brutal grab. The frantic hollow scratching of her talons on the floorboards grew increasingly desperate as she tried to pull away. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut. My chitin rippled darker, a coward sinking deeper into the structural paneling. Watching cruelty without intervening is a direct endorsement of the act, but biological survival always dictates complicity. I had spent my entire life perfecting the shameful art of not being seen. Drop her. The Terran's voice lacked any tonal inflection whatsoever. It carried no anger, no rising panic, no elevation in pitch. It was an absolute, undeniable observation of fact. Vrakkar paused his assault midway. He rotated his massive cranial ridge downward, finally registering the human as a tangible entity worth addressing. Soft skin. Walk away, his guttural words vibrated the deck plates beneath my boots. This is lineage business. Alina stood up slowly from the drone. She casually brushed a speck of gray dust off the sleeve of her canvas jacket, adjusting the collar with a slow, deliberate thumb. Her gaze remained entirely level, unblinking and intensely focused. Release the membrane, she stated clearly. That is your only warning. Her violence was not a sudden, uncontrolled rage state. It was a localized thermodynamic absolute. Terrans did not evolve by shedding their apex predator traits. They weaponized their profound empathy to survive a chaotic death world. Vrakkar laughed heartily. A concussive burst of air that smelled strongly of raw sulfur and recycled coolant washed over the corridor. He tightened his crushing grip on Lyra's delicate wing. The fragile bones beneath the bioluminescence groaned audibly under the immense pressure. You are vastly out of your depth, human, the Goreth mocked loudly. Your species relies entirely on machines and tools. Here, biology is the only law. Alina tilted her head slightly to the left. Her dark eyes locked instantly onto the articulation joint behind Vrakkar's massive right knee. She didn't draw a blaster or call for security. She merely adjusted her center of gravity, dropping her hips exactly 2 inches. The abrasive rustle of faded canvas fabric echoed sharply in the sudden stillness. The kinetic chain of her musculature coiled into absolute perfect alignment. The Brashian lackey snorted loudly, stepping forward to flank her position and cut off any retreat. 2 heavily armored juggernauts surrounding a creature composed primarily of water and calcium. The math was definitive. Any logical observer would calculate an immediate, fatal outcome for the Terran. Yet she smiled, a terrifying, predatory baring of blunt, omnivorous teeth. Biology is a tool, Alina replied calmly. You just don't know how to wield yours. Vrakkar shoved Lyra aside with a violent flick of his wrist. The Kaluman crumpled against the bulkhead, her brass compass skittering across the metal grating. The Goreth roared, a deafening sound that shook accumulated dust from the ceiling vents, and swung a massive obsidian limb directly at Alina's unarmored head. The strike carried enough raw kinetic energy to completely decapitate a synthetic security android. Alina vanished beneath the devastating arc. She ducked with barely a millimeter of clearance, allowing the Goreth's own terrifying momentum to pull his heavy frame forward into empty space. The corridor lost all oxygen. It wasn't magic, just the gravity of absolute predatory focus. Vrakkar attempted to rise, his pride blinding his survival instincts. Alina didn't shout, she simply stepped inside his guard, clamped her hands around his thoracic plating and torqued. The sickening crunch of hyperdense muscle folding painfully against its own gravity pierced the stagnant air. A Goreth's thick obsidian plating can easily withstand atmospheric re-entry, but it absolutely cannot withstand focused kinetic leverage applied directly to the weakest joints. The massive carapace shattered inward. The sharp crack of Goreth obsidian echoing off the aluminum walls wasn't just bone-breaking. It was the distinct sound of a 10,000-year biological hierarchy collapsing instantly into dust. Vrakkar hit the deck plates hard, incapacitated by agonizing systemic nervous shock. The Brashian lackey charged blindly forward, bellowing in confused, unfocused rage. Alina didn't even attempt to strike him. She smoothly caught his thick leading wrist, pivoted flawlessly on her heel, and redirected his massive charging weight using his own inertia. The heavy lackey slammed headfirst into the reinforced chromasteel bulkhead with bone-rattling force. He dropped heavily to the floor, completely unconscious before his thick knees ever hit the grating. Absolute silence slammed violently back into the transit tube. My camouflage cells failed completely. In a blinding silver flash of pure awe, my chitin abandoned its ash-gray hiding state. I stood completely exposed in the middle of the corridor. Alina slowly turned her head, her binocular vision locking instantly onto my illuminated form. She didn't attack or threaten me. She merely gave me a brief, acknowledging nod, then crouched down to help the trembling Lyra off the cold floor. Security forces breached the primary airlock exactly 10 seconds later, their weapons drawn and hands trembling at the mathematical impossibility of the brutal carnage before them. The immediate aftermath dissolved rapidly into bureaucratic and procedural chaos. The station administrators panicked, horrifyingly aware that a single unarmed Terran had effortlessly dismantled 2 Apex enforcers in less than 12 seconds. Alina faced an emergency disciplinary tribunal the very next day. She was largely exonerated due to the ancient defense of another clauses buried deep in galactic law, though the faculty remained deeply unsettled by her utterly unbothered demeanor. I spent the next 3 diurnal cycles extensively researching Terran biological imperatives in the archives. I learned about complex pack bonding. I learned that humanity views the defense of the helpless not as a philosophical choice, but as a mandatory evolutionary trigger deeply embedded in their DNA. The strange embroidery on her canvas jacket finally made perfect sense to me. Terra, handle with care, was never meant to be a self-deprecating joke about her own physical fragility. It was a genuine, desperate warning for our safety. The social culture of the Spire irrevocably shifted after that morning. The umbral transit tube permanently ceased to be a blind spot for the vulnerable. Students began walking openly through the corridors with their heads held high. When a frustrated predator tried to block a pathway, lesser scholars no longer stared blankly at the deck plates. They stopped walking. They actively watched the confrontation. They stood their ground in silent, collective defiance. Bystander syndrome completely evaporated in the lingering heat of a single human's absolute zero intervention. Alina and Lyra walked together through the bright dawn cycle illumination a week later. The Terran moved with that same loose-limbed grace, her canvas jacket cleanly repaired but still noticeably faded. Beside her, the young Kaluman girl didn't try to hide in the shadows anymore. The brass compass swung openly from Lyra's repaired flight harness. It caught the artificial sunlight beautifully, gleaming brightly against her chest with every step. The polished needle remained completely steady as she walked, pointing not toward safety but toward tomorrow.